Hey everybody, International Master David Bruce here, and today we're doing the final video in this How to Memorize Chess Game series. Today I'm going to give you a game that's about 43 moves long to sort of go up a couple levels from what we did last, which was 35 moves. Just go over a couple things real quick about this, but if you haven't watched the previous videos in this series, you kind of should watch them in order, because I'm not going to recap everything every time. But a couple things to remind you of with this. Number one is you want to push yourself one step at a time always. So if you've done the game that we memorized last video that was about 35 moves, you need to do some games that are 37 moves, 39 moves, 40 moves before you go on to this game. Just pick out some games for yourself and go through them. And when you go beyond this one, if you choose to memorize some more longer games, some end games, then do it step by step as well. Finally, as we're getting into these longer games, we still basically have two tools to help us really remember the games. One is to understand the games will help you to memorize the game. Sorry, did I say two tools to help you understand the game? I mean two tools to help you memorize the game. And one of those two tools to help you memorize the game is to understand the game. So I'm going to go through and give explanations as usual on this game so that hopefully you understand what was going on. And when you understand, then you know why the next move was next, and then you can remember it. And then the second tool is going to be chunking. So like understanding like little phases and segments of the game. Like there's a certain problem that the two players are facing in a certain position. They fight over that problem for a few moves, and then there's a resolution. And that string of moves is kind of like a chunk that you can remember. And then you go on to the next one. The other thing that you're going to find sometimes with these longer games is that you won't remember them exactly right. Sometimes there will be like one or two moves where they're a little bit more interchangeable. It's not as obvious in which order they were played. This is more often the case in middle games and end games than in the opening. But it also happens in the opening. But anyway, with longer games, you're more likely to have some stretch in the game where there's like a couple moves that are not that like significant or like crucial in which order they were played. And therefore it's hard to remember in which order they were played. And like me too, like I won't be able to remember those games typically because there's no particular meaning for why one move was played before the other. So I'm basically guessing with those moves. And obviously in my curation and selection of games for this series, I've mostly tried to pull out games that are on the easier side to memorize, that don't have all these interchangeable moves that don't matter. But in this game, you'll see one or two of those moves already, and that's fine because I want to let you know that these kind of moves do exist, and it's not always like trivial to memorize everything. And there's not always a reason for why one move was played before another move. So you don't have that to help you memorize. What I'd like to say about that basically is that it's okay if you don't remember every single move. If you know that at a certain point someone played two moves, for example, let's pull up a game for a second. So let's say you had this game. And you knew that white played the moves c3, e3, and knight bd2 as their next three moves, but you didn't remember in which order. Do you see how that might not matter and you might still be able to play out the whole game without knowing the order? Like black's moves were, d6 and castles and knight bd7, and white's moves were c3, e3, and knight d2. Like these are sort of interchangeable moves. They're not really interacting with each other. And so it doesn't really matter in which order they were played, and there isn't like a strong reason for it. You can always go back and reconstruct. You can always get to and reconstruct the correct position three moves down the road, right? Whether or not you play the next moves in the right order, you can get to this position here with black to move, and then some discussion of whether or not black should go for knight h5 or whether they should go for e5, right? So if this is like a position that you sort of remember, and you know that white started with the London system like this, right? But you're not sure in which order the next three moves were played, that's okay. Like I'm not here to tell you how to memorize the order of those 3 moves if there's no particular necessity or reason or purpose to that order. Okay, I would just tell you, remember the position that they get after 3 moves and then go to that position. And the same can be said for, let's say, a more mainline King's Indian defense. Say there's some really cool game in the mainline King's Indian in this position here, right, that you want to look at. Okay, but you don't remember if white played d4 or c4 on the first move or the second move, right? This could just as easily have been c4, knight f6, d4, g6, right? Or it could have been c4, knight f6, knight c3, g6, e4, avoiding the Grunfeld, d6, stopping e5, d4, bishop g7. It could just as well have been that move order. Does it matter? No. Like for me, I'm going to remember this as a chunk, right? Like it was a classical King's Indian. So in my head, what I remember is that this position was reached, a position I've seen like a bunch of times and that has a certain meaning to me. And that's enough, and that's fine for memorizing a game. Okay, so when you get little patches where it doesn't really matter the order in which a couple moves were played, just make sure that you remember sort of like what situation you got to, or what were the 3 moves that were played over the next 3 moves. And then you can play them out in different orders, but you'll still be able to reconstitute the whole game and play out the game correctly from a real position that occurred in the game. All right. Okay, let's reset it and let's start today's game. Today's game is one of my favorite games of all time. Again, it's the game that could have started with c4 or d4. But I know for sure that it was a Nimzo Indian, so I know that we got to this position, right? This is a game played by Kasparov and Karpov in their World Championship match of, I think it's from 1985, their second World Championship match. And it's one of the earlier games in that match, if not the first game of that match. And Kasparov played knight f3 here. And Kasparov's play and treatment of the 4 knight f3 Nimzo is something which has definitely inspired me throughout my own chess career. These are games that I saw pretty early on in my learning process, and I was like, wow, these games are fantastic. And I really appreciated them. And yeah, he had a good score with knight f3, and it's a cool move. So c5, black has a couple different ways they can answer knight f3, which is a flexible move itself. Black can play c5 or d5 or b6 or castles. So in this game, Karpov played c5. And one of the characteristics of the c5 variation is that it's harder for black to block the line diagonal on d5 because they no longer have the c6 pawn, right? So in response to c5, Kasparov was playing g3 always, putting the bishop in good position to put pressure on the queen side here. So yeah, so c5, it's attacking white on the dark squares in the center, and white's response is to say, yeah, I'm not fighting for the dark squares. I'm not playing e3. I'm not capturing on c5. I'm not playing a3 to try and bring this pawn in. I'm just letting you play c5, letting you trade off and open up the center, and putting my bishop on a diagonal that will be really strong after those kind of trades happen. Now, there's a number of sort of tactical aggressive options for black here, and Karpov used one of them, which is knight e4 attacking c3. White has to defend it. And then queen to a5, leaving the knight hanging, because after you take, which you do, and they take, so black would win the rook if white recaptured. So black didn't really sack the knight on e4. He won it back right away. Bishop to d2 is how white deals with this situation. You should be able to learn and remember some of these tactics, the move order on them being probably important, right? Like if you don't go for knight e4, if you play a move like queen a5, let's say white played, well, queen d3, you could still play knight e4, so it would transpose exactly. But let's say white played bishop d2. Now you can't play knight e4 anymore, and if you ever trade here, that's a bad tempo for black. Like, why are we playing queen a5? So knight e4 is played to put pressure on c3. If bishop d2, black can take on d2 and give you doubled, and get the bishop pair for themselves for the moment. I mean, bishop d2 looks maybe remotely playable to me, but suspicious. Queen d3, much more obvious, right? Supporting this, challenging this piece. And black goes for the tactic here like this. If black just traded on c3, then these moves that they're making are not that impactful. They're kind of losing time, right? Like if I take this way and then have to deal with my knight on e4, why did I move it twice? It's going to be under pressure in any position like this. It's going to be a liability that I wish I didn't move a second time. If, on the other hand, I trade the knight here, then after takes, I just have to move this piece again, right? Comes back here. And now I've moved the knight twice and the bishop twice. White's got 2 extra moves of development, and it's their move. So they're starting to get well ahead in development to a point that's kind of scary. Like they could play bishop g5, they could play bishop a3, they could play bishop g2 and castle and just ignore everything in the center and come out ahead in development. So not logical. The only logical follow-up to this is the move queen a5, trying to increase the pressure and use tactics to justify moving these pieces extra times. So queen a5, takes, blocks, defended by the knight. Now, because of the lineup with the queen, the bishop can't do anything but take. If black takes here, white can now take with the pawn. So he takes. And now this position here I've had myself before in tournaments, I'm pretty sure, although I don't remember my own games. I think one option for black is to play knight c6 here. But Karpov played a move which probably hadn't been played much before at that point, or they didn't have databases at the time. So it's not like people would know as fast if a move was good or bad as they do now. But this is a move which I think is basically a little bit dubious and wouldn't get played much after this. So the queen attacks these 2 points, forcing white into some kind of concession in theory that proves not to actually be a concession, okay? So the theory behind this move is, hey, I'm attacking 2 of your weaknesses on dark squares after trading dark squared bishops, so I'm going to force a concession out of white. In practice, you got to feel like it's very cheeky of black, right, to play all these moves with his pieces, like with these same 3 pieces, and do nothing about the queenside pieces, which are a little bit harder to use. I mean, mainly this bishop. So he's doing nothing about that, fighting cheekily with his queen, but white's in position to kind of get developed pretty fast here. So, yeah. So I don't recommend this, and I think when you see this game, you won't be recommending it either. Now, the concession that white makes is to take on c5 and get doubled isolated pawns. That's the concession white makes, and I think you should be able to remember that in this position, white chose to take on c5 based on the fact that that's kind of like one of the underlying themes of this game, is that white takes on these doubled isolated pawns, and they are good doubled isolated pawns. And that's kind of one of the most interesting things about this game, is the positional judgment that these pawns are good. So doubled pawns, you've generally heard that they're bad. In theory, why might they be good? Well, one reason the doubled pawns are good is because they give you an open file. You might say, hey, it's not like the pawns that give me the open files. You could have open files without having doubled pawns. Yes, but if I have doubled pawns, it's one way for me to have more open files than my opponent. Same with a pawn sack or a gambit, right? It means you've got an extra open file for your, or half open file because it's blocked by the black pawns, right? You've got an extra half open file that your rooks can operate on because your pawns are occupying less files. That may seem like it's not part of the pawns, but it is part of the pawns. There's no way you can give your opponent doubled pawns without giving them an open file. And that's something that you just need to keep track of when you are when you're talking about the advantage of the double of, when you're talking about like a disadvantage, like some weak doubled pawns. Realize that they're always giving an open file, which is some kind of compensation or counter advantage for your opponent. So in this case, the reason why these are particularly good doubled pawns is because black has 2 backward pawns on the semi-open files that white gets, And these pawns are pretty far advanced, so they're actually providing restraining services against black's pawns, keeping them from moving. Now, these pawns are not only backward pawns, they're also blocking in this bishop. So at this point, let's say black's queen were suddenly magically back on e7, and white had developed and defended this pawn with like knight e4 or something. White would tend to have a positional advantage here because black would have trouble getting this bishop out, and because black could come under some pressure on these semi-open files. All right, so that's my evaluation of the general positional feature here, and you know, the game goes that way as well. But let's continue with the game now. This rook is attacked. White plays rook to b1, developing the rook for free. And you can see that white is gaining a little bit of an advantage here in terms of development. Now black plays the move queen c3. This is kind of a key moment because you might wonder about queen a3, queen a2, and then the move black plays queen c3. So first, here's why black doesn't play queen a2. It's because white can play queen d4. This is a very powerful square for the queen because dark squared bishops have just been traded. There's all these open diagonals, right, and weak dark squares. And from here, she can take on g7 or she can play rook a1, trapping the queen. And that is a double threat, which basically destroys black's position here, right? They have to save their queen away like this. And meanwhile, white takes on g7 and black can't castle. And he loses one of his last pawns that's defending dark squares, right? Which means he's more and more likely to get stuck with all these pawns on light squares and to have no control over the dark squares. So, yeah. So hopefully you can imagine that some position like this wouldn't be good for black. Yeah? Just as an example for those who don't believe that taking on a2 would be bad. All right, so the second option, queen a3. It took me a while longer to realize why black had to go queen c3 instead of queen a3. So queen a3 attacks the pawn on c5, which I said it's an example of a good doubled pawn, but it's also a weak doubled pawn in the sense that it's hard for white to defend it, right? So, I mean, you can still attack this thing and try to win it. But the key to what will happen is that, again, white will use this square here for the queen, and it's very powerful, even though it doesn't win tactically. You attack g7, black castles to defend it, for example, and now we play bishop g2. And the point is that, amazing as this bishop is, if black plays knight c6, I want to keep my queen on this amazing d4 square. So much so that my plan is just to trade on c6. Black can take back either way. Both ways are bad, so I'm not going to stress too much about which way I have black take. And then white's going to castle. Now, whichever way black took, he'd be left with one backward pawn on an open file. He'd be left with a bad bishop. And he'd be left with white's queen sort of temporarily dominating the center of the board from here. And white's knight is going to come to a really good dark square at some point. For example, d6. Okay, so this would be a huge advantage for white. I mean, yeah. Really, really huge. So what black does by playing queen c3 is they're trying to keep white's queen off of controlling this main dark square diagonal in the center of the board. And very often, right after a pair of bishops is traded and the other pair of bishops is still on the board, the colored squares that are not controllable by these bishops become prime squares for the queens to get control of. And so you'll see people playing moves to try and take control of these squares with their queen. And so white, his follow-up move is that he's going for queen d4, and black is trying to prevent it. Okay? But this allows white to play a kind of cool move. The queen is black's only good piece. It's a strong piece. It's an annoying piece. It's keeping white's king from castling. It's pinning down the knight. It's controlling the dark squares. This piece has to go. It's way too strong. So, of course, in this position, Kasparov plays rook to b3, right? That was just a trick. That allows checkmate in one. Just seeing if you guys are awake. You got to stay awake when you're trying to learn something. All right. So, no. But white does need to do something about this queen since it's a powerful piece. And here Kasparov plays queen d3, just going for a queen trade. And if no queen trade, then black's going to have to spend another move, moving their queen away somewhere and relinquishing control of some squares that she's on right now. So queen d3 is a move by which Kasparov gives up one tempo of development, right? By moving his queen again instead of another piece. But it was essentially unavoidable since this queen is keeping him from castling. So he loses one tempo of his development in order to trade off the opponent's best piece. Black does trade. Now, you would think when you have a development lead that the two things you wouldn't want to do are lose time and trade pieces, right? That's your instinct, I would think or hope. But one of the surprising techniques that you can realize about development is that actually you very often want to trade off your opponent's best pieces because it isolates their bad pieces and leaves them with their bad pieces, which then it's more obvious how bad their bad pieces are versus your good pieces when you've traded off their best one or two pieces that were involved, right? I mean, someone invests a lot of moves getting a piece into like a really good square, and then you just trade off that piece, and then their remaining pieces, it's really obvious how poorly placed they are. Okay. The other advantage that Kasparov got out of this, it's not necessarily an advantage, but his isolated doubled pawns are just doubled pawns now. He connected this to them, so he can actually defend them a little bit in an endgame, right? Either this way or this way, one of them. I mean, it's not a pure advantage because the D file was a good file for a rook as well, but it has its uses to be able to defend these pawns a little bit extra. And another thing about these pawns being, and it comes in handy right away since he defends the pawn right away, Karpov goes for the developing move that attacks this and sort of quasi-gains a tempo, but the knight's not in great position here. The other thing about doubled pawns is when they're connected to other pawns, it's better to have them in front of the other pawn than behind the other pawn. If you imagine these two pawns are on these two squares instead, then they're behind the d4 pawn, which means the d4 pawn can't defend them against attack. And if the opponent blockades them on a square like c4, let's just make a new board so I can show this point. Take off legal and just show you this. If I have a pawn structure like this, the opponent has a pawn structure like this, they can control this square, and you can't move these pawns because this pawn can no longer help them control that square. It can't evict a piece that blockades them, and it can't defend them if they get attacked. So this is a worse configuration for doubled pawns with the neighboring pawn ahead of them. It's a worse configuration than this one with their neighbor pawn behind them. He can choose to defend either one or to attack the blockade square if necessary. So here the pawn comes in and defends this one. All right, now, here's the position where I sometimes get the moves in the wrong order. Black's next three moves are, they move this rook here to defend the pawn and to get off this diagonal. They lift the king to be able to use this rook, and they bring this rook to d8 so that if they play d6 at some point, the rook can get into the game. They still have no way to use this piece for the moment. White's next three moves are bishop g2, king e2, and knight e4, right? Developing these three pieces to better squares and allowing this rook to get into the game. But in what order are they played? The order is actually not that important. So remember, that the next three moves, the players play the logical three moves to improve and develop their positions and don't necessarily worry about the order. It's actually rook b8. For a while, I thought it was king e7 first, but I think it's rook b8. Now, white plays bishop g2. If you really wanted to prevent black from having an opportunity to play d6, you should play knight e4 to control that square. But white actually, as you'll see, and this is one thing worth knowing, and there's an idea and a way to understand it, white actually wasn't worried about black playing d6. So the option that white gave by not playing knight e4 faster was d6 for black. So knight e4 is the last of these three moves white plays. d6, right? Getting rid of one of the doubled pawns, maybe making some room for the bishop. And white basically could have prevented this if he wanted to. The move doesn't seem to lose, so why didn't black go for it? Well, it's an example of a move that doesn't really change the evaluation very much. It doesn't help nor hurt black all that much. So white can take once, then play c5, again, putting pawns on the dark squares where they control potentially weak squares and don't block your bishop. and force your opponent to keep their pawns on light squares that do block their bishop, right? So king e7 or c7, whichever, and then knight c4, rook c1. White has incredible pressure this way too. Black has basically traded a backward pawn that was kind of blocking his bishop for a doubled pawn that wasn't really doing anything for white. So they've each traded one bad pawn with each other, and white still maintains an advantage based on the pressure of these two nice pieces, and now some space in the center too. I don't want to overload you with variations, but if something like this happened, the bad position of black's king would now cost him at least one. Right? No way to keep this pawn defended and avoid, knight b6 check. So we get to this position. Black doesn't play d6. They play the final developing move. And now white plays knight e4. All right. So clearly black's not going for d6. They could sit here forever, and white would double rooks on the b file, play knight e4, and then capture the pawn on b7 that he's got pressure against, right? So I think more often than not, it's the case that if you're under pressure with like a backward pawn like this, that you want to look for a chance as early as possible to play b6 and to try and break instead of just waiting here and letting your opponent beat up on it forever. I mean, an exception would be, and I mean, this covers a lot of positions, but if you've got some kind of really good counterplay somewhere else, then you might just defend this as long as you can and attack white's king. But here, black is basically bereft of counterplay, right? All their pieces are kind of passive, and white doesn't. White has pretty active pieces, which have a range of motion across the board. There are no queens on the board, so there's not even going to be an attack against white's king. So, nothing special for black to do here. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention this, but did you notice how white played king e2 instead of castling? That's typical in the endgame, right? That you'd rather have your king nearer to these pawns so you can defend them if necessary, and you're less worried about your king getting checked, especially with black having like no active pieces. We just saw a variation here where the position of black's king could become a liability, right? And that's because there are still enough pieces for king positions to be vulnerable in this position. It's like partway between a middle game and an end game. White has just enough pieces to really threaten a king. The reason that white is so confident to play king e2 is that black has no active pieces, so the white king is definitely not going to come under fire. The black king didn't castle because he wanted to at least try and like defend a little bit because he was in sort of a desperate situation of defense here. Okay, so rook d8, knight e4. So black finally breaks with b6. And this is definitely a critical position for this game. White's plan has been to put pressure here. If black had done nothing, it would have been very easy to play the game. We would have just doubled rooks and won the game without ever having to calculate a single variation. But now our opponent plays b6. If you're white, unfortunately, he's forced you to calculate something if you want to win this game. So try to calculate it, right? There's two major options here. One option is to trade once on b6 and then go back to doubling rooks, right? So for example, we trade one pawn, they take back, you play rook b3, rook b2, rook b5, one of these moves, right? And then the plan is to go rook to b1 and put pressure on this. Seems like a pretty good option, right? Pretty smooth and simple. If black takes with his rook, you can also trade, which actually gets your reserve rook into the game even faster. And it looks like you'll win a pawn pretty comfortably in that variation at least. So a takes b6, rook b2. How about this line? How good or bad is this for us? Well, it might just give your opponent a chance to try and break out a little bit. So d5, trade. He might even be able to play rook d5 here. Depends on the calculation. Does this have any like really strong move? Like rook d5, does this do anything? Rook d4. This piece is defended. Looks okay. So yeah, he might even be able to play rook d5 here instead of pawn d5. And now once black plays rook to a5, even if you win this pawn, you'll probably lose this pawn. It's looking hard for white to kind of like conveniently come out ahead here, right? Defend this pawn, rook to a5, attacking this one. I mean, white is still better, right? But not easily winning a pawn immediately. And black's forces definitely have like more scrappy opportunities here. So this is actually not the choice that Kasparov went for. He didn't go for this. Instead, he went for something tactical with knight to d6. And the justification behind knight d6 is he's trying to prevent black from ever taking on c5 based on playing knight takes c8 and then bishop b7 attacking the knight on a6. The knight on a6 has to stay here to defend the rook. So it's basically looking like, wait, how does black ever take on b6 against the knight on d6? And so this position here was a really critical choice for white between knight d6 and pawn b6. And the very critical moment for black was how he wanted to respond after knight d6. What Karpov did was he played knight c7 to go to knight e8 and try and trade off this knight on d6. His other option is he has to calculate, what if I just, again, cut the Gordian knot right away, make this trade, what happens? So white takes here with check. Black takes back, and now bishop b7. Rook takes, rook takes. So black's down in exchange. Take this pawn, right? So center pawn, activate the rook. Rook takes pawn, attacks the knight, and stops rook c4. And this is actually slightly awkward for black what to do with the knight here. If you go to b4, then if white plays like a3 or something, you still have to block your own rook on c6. But I think white would play rook b1 and develop his rook. So let's just say black plays knight c5, and let's just try to evaluate this position. Black has a knight and a pawn against a rook, which in most endgames is really inadequate. Here, however, he's got like a pretty nice position in the center to try and restrain white's king from joining the game. And so it looks like he may have some chances. I've seen this position evaluated differently by different people. I've seen someone say that black has fine counterplay, and this is what Karpov should have done. Personally, I still think that this is good for white, who obviously takes the other open file here. I think white has very good chances to convert this endgame. Yeah, I think white could also go takes here and take on c5, right? Another option, and then just plan to bring out his pieces. The plan is like rook to b1, and then bring the rook into b7 or b8 somehow. So if black plays knight c6, you can just trade it and bring your rook in and win. And you also have a plan, if there's no penetration point, you can go to a3. If black somehow covers these squares, which he can't really. So black can try and get out. And white wins a piece. And again, this variation, I saw someone say that black basically has good chances to draw this endgame. But again, it's also obvious to me that white has chances to win it. So I think it's not clear what would happen in either of these options. But you can see that there was like a serious calculation required. And that this is kind of like a critical moment of the game. Kasparov's choice to go knight d6, relying on tactics to prevent this. Karpov has the option to maybe take on c5, but he has to calculate two different variations with different weird material sacrifices trying to grovel in those bad endgames. And he chooses not to. He chooses to instead try and hang on with sort of grim defense for the moment. So he goes knight to c7. And now Kasparov's going to double on the b file. And you have to choose between these moves. He went to b4. And probably the reason he preferred b4 over b3 was to give sideways protection to these two pawns in various variations. Okay, so that's how you can remember it. Obviously wants to double while black's doing this. Now he trades it off. I mean, he could do something else. He could just keep his piece, but he trades it off because he's ready to now double the rooks and win a pawn on b6. And at this point, white's basically winning a pawn without any real difficulties. And we can see kind of the triumph of the strategy with these doubled pawns, how hard it was for black to even challenge it. And then even once you've challenged it, to be pinned, you know, whichever way you go by the pressure of white's pieces. And what I really like about this and other Kasparov games is just how clear the strategy is, right? Like he just, from the opening straight through to the end, right? I mean, you can look back to move 9, right? Karpov plays this move, challenging him. Kasparov thinks, and he comes up with a solution. I'm going to take on c5, take these isolated pawns, right? Go into this position and just beat him on this b file. And then he does. We get here, and you can see how this position is clearly related to his opening decision when he took those isolated pawns and how those were basically good doubled pawns. So let's go through the wrap up. Often when it's impossible to defend a pawn, you can still forestall losing by counterattacking your opponent's pawns. So if you're in this situation as black, you want to consider moves like bishop a6 and d6 and d5 before you just throw in the towel and resign. The other thing you can consider is playing bishop b7 to try and trade bishops, because rook endings will give you a slightly better chance to draw. Yeah, so Karpov plays bishop a6, attacking this pawn. So if you take with your rook, you lose on c4, and white's not even better. So this king needs to move. Kasparov moves it up and defends one of these pawns. He could have also gone to d3 to defend this pawn extra, but what he wants to be able to do is to move the pawn. So it's two different options, right? Like if you come here, you defend the pawn. If you come here, you leave the pawn some mobility. And since this doubled pawn is about to get traded, this pawn can finally move. So that's his preference here. And in this position, Karpov lashes out with the last pawn here. And there's more than one way to win here. I think you could just trade on d5 and trade on b6, but what Kasparov does is he takes on d6. And the point is, after rook d6, to be able to play c5 with this pawn, and that's why the king's not here. So he takes en passant, and Karpov plays this move instead of taking. So he's trying to cut off the move c5 because he can then take it. And so he's trying to prevent c5 and maybe capture this pawn next move. Meanwhile, he's counterattacking the pawn on c4. So a good question to ask yourself here, a nice little puzzle test for yourself, is how should white play here? How did Kasparov play here to get the advantage? Okay. So in the game, what he did was he just defended the pawn with king d3. But in this position, I think there's an example of an easier solution for Kasparov would have been to play the tactical move rook a4, trying to trap this bishop. If you considered this move at all, good for you for looking at it. Since the bishop's attacked, it forces it to come here. Now you go after its defender, bishop here. And in this position, I think black is just losing heavy material. Like he's going to lose an exchange and you're going to take on a7. Because if he tries to move b5 to save his bishop and give him time to save this, then this move wins for white, allowing you to take this with check. Right? Or here you get to take 2 rooks. So Kasparov just defends his pawn. And Karpov takes back on d6. And now Gary traps the bishop. All right? Totally trapped. Simple chess. In order to save it, he has to play b5, defending it with the rook. Capture. Bishop's still trapped. The only way to save the bishop is this move. Pinning the pawn, right? So that saves the bishop for the moment. The b5 pawn is attacked here. So you can't take here because he'll take, and you lose. And you can't play bishop c6 check because after rook takes bishop again, you're in bad shape. Actually, I guess there you can still draw just fine like this. But anyway, he defends his extra pawn. And now Karpov trades off the bishops to go to the rook endgame. Sometimes if you really want bishops, you can retreat your bishop to keep bishops on the board. But if you just let black put his bishop on d5 while yours hides on f1, your bishop's going to be so much worse than his that very often with bishops and rooks, if there's key diagonals and files, you can't avoid trades very easily, or it's a big concession to avoid them. So we get to this rook and pawn endgame, and Gary's up 1 pawn. He's got a slightly weak isolated d pawn, and the win is not trivial in this position, not at all. So how do you win this kind of position? One thing you'd like to do is maybe take the c file. The second thing you might like to do is advance your pawn majority and make a queen with it, right? To me, those are the 2 ideas that spring to mind of oh yeah, I'd like to do that. At the same time, you want to do that in a way that doesn't give your opponent too much counterplay, right? So you don't want to allow him to win your pawn with e5 at some surprising moment. You don't want him to go capture your pawn on h2, or play his pawn to h3 and have a counterplay threat. Okay, so first, Kasparov starts by just building strength. The reason is that if Karpov tries to take the file from him, it's going to allow this pawn to come through pretty strongly. So Karpov's not really in position to take this file from him at the moment. And not only that, Gary wouldn't be averse to playing rook c4 and just trading a rook. So first he plays a4. This defends his most valuable asset, and it gets these pawns closer to queening. Defending his most valuable asset frees both of these rooks for other actions, especially on the c file. Karpov plays king e7, just bringing his king a little bit closer. And here's where Kasparov plays 2 interesting moves that it's not immediately obvious why these are good technique. The first one is he plays h4. And you're going to see this move played in rook and pawn endings time and time again by the attacker and the defender. A very, very common thing. So what's the point behind this kind of technique in a rook and pawn ending? One reason is having all your pawns on the second row means that if your opponent ever lands a rook on the second row, they can eat 1 pawn per move. If I arrange my pawns like this, and I have to, I'm using my king to come attack on the queen side and push my pawn home, black can only eat these pawns 1 pawn every 2 moves. So that's one major advantage to not having your pawns all sitting on the second row in the endgame. Other advantages, you gain space. You keep your opponent from getting counterplay. They can play a move like h5, h4 sometimes, and it creates positive tension for them against this structure. If you take, you've got very weak doubled isolated pawns. They can attack with their rooks easily. If you don't take, then they could possibly go to h3. You have to worry about the pawn being close to queening. Or they can put their rook on the h file, so they're threatening to trade and use the file. So letting your opponent get the pawn to h4 could be annoying. So h4. Also gaining space. If you gain more and more space, you could nail down an extra weakness for your opponent somewhere here, some pawn that can't advance if you need a second weakness to win, which you might. You can't necessarily always win these endgames just by pushing these pawns straight through. Normally at some point you'll have to attack something over here once this pawn has diverted enough of their forces to the queen side. So gaining space to do that. And also you're going to try and play these pawns in a way so that not all these pawns get traded. Since you're the one trying to win, you're going to want extra pawns on the board. So there's something for you to go attack with your king at some point over there. Okay, so black plays h6, and their idea is to possibly play g5 and trade one pawn at some point. And now Gary plays the move f3, which I completely don't understand. And I have thought about this move for like 3 weeks, trying to prepare this video, and I can't tell you the reason for that move. Sorry. But this is the pawn structure that he arranges for himself over on the king side. And it's pretty flexible against black trying to attack it, and pretty flexible against black trying to trade pawns or attack it with his rook. So that's apparently part of it, and it's also gaining space. Now, Karpov goes for his counterplay. So he goes rook d5. His idea is to now use this rook to try and fight against these pawns somehow. Play g5 maybe, play rook f5 maybe, right? And just have some more power on the king side to start trading off Gary's pawns before he gets forced into a totally passive situation. The rook also fights against these pawns a little bit from the side. Like if Gary played a5, he actually wouldn't be threatening b6 because of rook takes a5. So, you might have wondered like 2 moves ago when he's playing h4 and f3, why isn't he just playing a5, b6? Well, if you just play a5 and your opponent plays rook d5, you might actually get your majority frozen rather than getting it rolling, right? This is the key variation I'm trying to mention, right? And it just a trade. Well, I mean, it's losing your extra pawn. All you can do is trade on a7 at the end. So he goes for f3, rook d5. The rook seems good here. But now Gary goes to the c file. And he does it with this rook instead of this rook because he's thinking of playing rook c5 or rook c6 or rook c7 at some point, and this rook is doing extra work defending his pawns along the 4th rank. Okay, whichever rook he does, the remaining rook would be undefended, and so it would be pinned like this. So the only reason to choose this rook is that this rook is doing some work on the 4th rank. And now he can deal with a move like g5, some kind of attempt at counterplay on the king side. He can deal with that by playing rook c5, trading off this rook. And that's kind of simplifying his task. Or even if black doesn't trade himself and goes here and lets him do this. Now he's given black an isolated pawn too and traded off 1 rook. And there's still plenty of pawns for his king to go attack. And black's rook is going to be defending against this. So yeah, so the major idea he's looking at here is to play rook c5 at some point at the moment. But he's got other ideas too. Like playing rook here and then using both rooks to try and penetrate to c7 possibly, which would be even more decisive. So Karpov plays rook d7 to prevent rook c5 for the moment because rook takes. All right. So now this rook having moved, it's the signal. Gary's now going to push his majority while it's not frozen. And here you see he's actually threatening b6 because of rook a5, b7. So b6 is the big threat here. If black comes back here trying to freeze the pawns again with this rook a5 idea, now he's ready to play rook c5. And see, he's strong enough to support all this and keep pushing forward. So very often, if you have a majority of pawns somewhere in the board in an endgame and you're trying to make use of it, and you're trying to say, at what rate do I advance it? The further I advance it, the more of a threat it is to tie up the opponent's pieces, but also the further advanced it gets and the more liable it is to getting undermined. You really have to calculate some basic variations, right? Like, can my opponent freeze it or can I support it? Can I keep pushing it, right? Am I threatening to keep pushing it? So, yeah. So here Karpov goes for his counterplay since he can't stop this anymore. He can't stop rook c5 and b6. So he goes for his counterplay. And Kasparov trades and plays g4, defending this pawn. Actually, I'm even forgetting whether he played b6 first. So let's just see if we can figure it out. When you're memorizing games, memorizing them doesn't mean that you know every move in order in a row. It means that you understand the game well enough that you can reconstruct it. So let's see if I can reconstruct it. Does b6 work or not? So if rook a5, b7 wins, if pawn takes h4, b7 wins. So he'd have to take, Now, what's the worst that can happen to white here? If e5, b7, yeah, it's just threatening to win right away. So it forces him over here. And now rook c7 doesn't win because black can trade and play king here. Now he could make his trade on g5. And it looks like it would be about the same. Yeah, it looks like it should be the same. So maybe he just played b6 right away. I'm not even sure myself. Force him away, trade here. g4 defending this. And black can't really stop rook c5 here. Oh, he could play king d6. And then we'd have to switch our methods like so. Does this win for white? Probably. You can go takes, 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 takes. Rook here, here, here. And that should finish the game. So as far as I can tell, this holds up. But let's just go double check this so I tell you guys this right. You know, just because someone's going to be mad if I get it if I get the move wrong. So he trades first, like I first thought, and only now he'll play b6, I think, here. So it looks like he could have probably just played b6 right here immediately, but he did this trade first and played g4, stopping the counterplay. Idea is to play rook h1. I guess he hasn't yet committed these pawns as much, but his plan is either rook c5 or rook h1. Karpov played h5, trying to trade off the last pawns, and now b6. Has to take it, has to block here, and rook c5. Attacking these, right? If black takes, then he's threatening c6, right? So can't allow c6, have to play here. White takes this, king here, whatever. White can win in any way now that he's got this one too. So after rook c5, Karpov locks his rook away from this side of the board. Right? And now with all this in strong position and this piece locked away, it's okay with Gary that the king side just got traded off because he's got enough to win by force with this pawn now. Tries to bring the rook back to defend against the king penetrating here. And now he doubles rooks and he gets rook c4 in. And then king c6 and b7. And this pawn is completely unstoppable given the good position of white's pieces. So Karpov just resigned here. But for example, something like this, could play here, attacking this pawn. You can see what excellent position white's pieces are in here compared to black's. I don't know, something like this. And now finally we'll go here and bring our king in. I don't know, one example of how he could have won from this position. Among multiple. D5 also wins here because after takes, you can take with check and then take this pawn too. Can maybe also win with rook c1, rook h1. Anyway, guess we don't need to go into it in too much depth. King c6 probably also wins. So an excellent game by Gary. One of my favorite games of all time. A good positional crush straight through with good endgame technique. So critical moment in the opening, the fight over the central squares with the queens, where black plays queen c3 and white plays queen d3. That's like a crucial thing, setting up the whole endgame. And then the next critical moment was when black chose to play b6, trying to break things up, and Gary went for knight d6 versus pawn takes b6. And I've played through this game a whole bunch of times in the last month. studying it again and again and again, and just really enjoying it. And what you want to do is just like remind yourself, recalculate some of these variations, and they slowly sink in, and eventually you just sort of like own the game. It's just a part of you that you carry around with you. For me personally, I think that Rook Endgame is going to be some of like the best stuff for me to carry with me from this. Just the way he like built strength, right? That A4 was the priority over Rook C1 or Rook C4 taking the C file. A4, then H4, and then that the timing was actually kind of tricky around Rook C1 and A5 and Rook C5 and when to do it. There's a bunch of little calculations in all those variations, which I didn't take the time to show you because this video was getting long. But yeah, a bunch of like cool little calculations that you basically have to do to play those things correctly, and that you have to do in order to be able to remember and recover this game from your memory once you've seen it before. So you have to just calculate those again and see how they work. So yeah, I hope that's useful to you. I hope you can use the ideas and strategies from this game, and that you can memorize the game by understanding those things and then carry it with you always. That's all for now. I'm done with the series at this point. If you want to keep pushing yourself, if you're someone who likes endgames and you want to learn a bunch of 50, 60 move games, by all means, go for it. I will probably post at some point a list of good games that you can use for this purpose of memorizing games. But I'm going to have to call the series somewhere. I'm going to call it here. All right. Next up, I've started work on a series of my own best games. So I've got a couple of those coming, and I'll be doing coverage of the Carlsen Anand Return World Championship match, which starts in just a few days. So take care, everybody, and be well.